Welcome, everyone. I'm Greg Lindsay. Welcome to the Augmented City Seeing Through Disruption, which is not coincidentally the title of my report that was published in December 24 for the Urban Tech Hub at Cornell Tech's Jacobs Institute on the potential implications of full-scale XR for cities. It's the intersection of technology and government, public policy. It was created, of course, using threat casting as its core foresight methodology. But we're not here to talk about augmented reality necessarily today. Here to talk about the companion methodology to threat casting, which is science fiction prototyping, using the specifics of stories and narrative to create not just plausible futures, but to actually create futures. And for that, I am joined by two of the smartest people I know. One is the inspiration of the report in many ways and is interviewed for it. I see that skeptical look on your face, Keichii. And the other person is helped create some of the stories as part of that, who created the science fiction. But before we get into that, I want to invite Threatcasting.ai principal Cindy Kuhn to come on out and welcome folks. Cindy, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to jump in really quick and welcome all of our guests who I know you are about to experience a magical session. And so I'm really excited myself to be here and excited you are here. And I also want to encourage our live listeners and those who listen to the recording later to visit us often at Threatcasting.ai. This is really our new home for the entire Threatcasting family. And as Greg mentioned, I'm Cindy Kuhn. I'm the co-founder of Threatcasting. And while we still have partnerships at universities and other organizations, we have made this our home. And so if you're ever curious, who's working on what are we doing, what are we producing, come on back to Threatcasting.ai. This is where you will find all of our family members' contributions to threat casting. So thank you for being here, and I'm excited.
All right. Well, thank you, Cindy. Um, yeah, just to dive in here, we're joined today, our practitioner, conversationalist here. First, I want to introduce Keichii Matsuda. Keichii is best known as a filmmaker. His short film Hyperreality from 2016 is probably his most famous work that's literally cited to this day by executives at Meta, at Snap, Niantic, and other practitioners in the field as the most fully realized vision of what urban scale XR would look like, and through a decidedly dystopian lens. And so Keichii, though, is unique with his studio Liquid City, which he co-founded with Anna Mill, illustrator of Square Eyes and a gorgeous new version of Neuromancer, where they are literally using science fiction prototyping to not just lay out scenarios, but to like basically put out ideas and then actually build them as a developer. So Keichii is going to talk a bit about this sort of pipeline from fiction to reality. And then also joined by Madeline Ashby, who is author of, on her fiction side, most recently Glass Houses. And then on her corporate side, again, I just have a whole pile of books here to show, is she's the co-author of How to Future with Scott Smith. And so Madeline also has a long history of working with companies to basically help them actualize this. So we're gonna have a great conversation here about, yeah, the uses of science fiction, not just as cautionary tales and not just as plausible scenarios, but in actually using it as a way to both drive companies and drive products, but then also drive change in organizations as well. So I want to invite Keichii to start because the ability of Zoom is we can show and not just tell. And so Keichii, would love it if you could basically offer an introduction to your work at Liquid City and yeah, and basically how you're using fiction to create the future.
Oh, hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Keichii. Thanks very much for having me. It's exciting to be here to talk about Greg's area of interest because it's very close to my own. I also made a film called The Augmented City back in 2010. But I haven't, I haven't litigated yet. But we'll see.
You have your right.
Um, uh, yeah, Greg referred to some of my earlier like filmmaking work. So Hyperreality, this is another one from 2017 called Merger. And I was very interested at this time to be thinking about how technologies are going to change the way that we experience everyday life in the world. And I was an architecture student at this time. Well, actually, this was after then, but my background is in architecture. So I was at the time very interested, especially around the production of spaces that were physical and virtual. But then I got the amazing opportunity in 2017 to work for Leap Motion, who developed hand tracking interfaces or hand tracking technology. And then I was brought in to work on design and think about how the relationship between your body and the spaces around you could allow you to do different things. So basically building new types of interface using your hands, your body, your voice, other things to be able to modulate and interact with computers. So then, yeah, as Greg said, we set up our studio, Liquid City, a few years ago, and we've been using kind of storytelling methodology a lot to be able to set out, new concepts, especially when they're quite difficult to be able to grasp or through just words alone, and maybe the implications also spanning across many different types of discipline. It's very helpful to be able to make films and have stories that can help guide product development. So in this particular case, we made this film called Agents, where we reimagined the apps that you use on an everyday basis as these kind of AI agents that are represented in AR as these little characters, and you can kind of make them yourself, or other people can make them. You could have a whole ecosystem, and the central premise of the film is the kind of antagonist that she meets has this kind of one agent that does everything, and sucks up all of her data, and gives her this kind of supposedly idealized experience, and just trying to kind of think a little bit about how we could transition to a world where our interaction with computers is not through devices that we hold and touch, but through these kind of ghosts or spirits that inhabit the world around us, and we can kind of commune with in these different ways, either through glasses or through earphones or whatever else it is. But maybe the part that Greg wanted me to get to is to talk about that we've been using this kind of we've in parallel to making films about this type of future, we've also been building and prototyping it as well. So we've built many projects now that you can use for real to talk to these different agents who have different purposes, from being teachers, like our project Wall that you see on the top, where this owl teaches you about the forests, to our project Wisp down on the bottom, which is kind of a companion for longer periods of time. And then we have like a game show host and a bunch of other different types of agent for that. And yeah, I think this is sorry. Yeah, this is the most recent one, which is a kind of RPG that you can play in the world around you, where the characters have an understanding of all of the objects in your space. And you basically have to go on a scavenger hunt in your own house to be able to uncover more of these little creatures that you can talk to. Yeah. Yeah, and the final thing I wanted to share with you as well is like one of these new agents we've been building is an interviewer that helps you tell stories from your life, even if you think you don't really have many good stories to tell. So you can just open up this app and talk to it, and it's going to interview you and get a good story out of you. So this is a new thing that we're building, and if anybody would be interested to try it, you can scan here to join our WhatsApp community, and we'll be pushing a new update for the app that will become available to test, I think either today or tomorrow. So we'd love it if anybody would be interested in being a very early tester in a new one of these new interaction paradigm. Yeah.
Excellent.
Is that all
Thank
right?
you,
You told me to keep it short. I was trying to keep it
Well,
short.
we'll get a link in the chat, and people will get people to sign up momentarily in that one. But thank you for that overview. And people are already chiming in; they already are one. I should note, by the way, for participants, and thank you all so much for joining. I do not have to listen to myself speak here. So if you want to start putting questions into the chat or into, I don't know if we have a Q&A box. I think just into the chat. I'll start calling them relatively early because there's more intelligence certainly here in the audience than there is certainly in me. But before we move on from there, I want to go to Madeline next. So Madeline, and I'll put a link in as well. Madeline wrote a half dozen short stories to accompany the findings in the report. So if people familiar with threatcasting, you encourage participants to tell stories, and then those stories are then refined and then published from there. And so in that case, we did the same thing in creating the Augmented City report version, not the film version. Don't sue. In that case, basically participants spun out how augmented reality would intersect with all these different challenges, and then Madeline took that as raw material and expanded from there. So we'll put that out there. But Madeline, I guess that's my question for you: is how do you see the sides as a writer here? How do you sort of see your pure science fiction interacting with your foresight work in this and drawing on this? We'll come back to Keichii about how he made that transition from pure filmmaker into developer and how that roadmap there. But how do you draw upon that, like on the double hemispheres of your brain?
Increasingly, I think, well, one, thank you for having us, and thanks for hosting this. Like, this is lovely. And I love the opportunity to meet everybody and so But increasingly, I feel like there's less and less difference because, like, sort of, I think there used to be a time where I could say that that what was being depicted in sort of commercial science fiction and what was being depicted in science fiction prototypes for like clients. So like the difference between creating something for mass market publication or commercial release versus what was being depicted sort of in the very limited context of for a corporate client, those have sort of merged as more people are opening up the research that they're doing. Um, the difference really in the practice is that when a client asks me a question, you they're asking something like they're asking a very specific question about what is the future of augmented reality usage by this demographic in this location in this time. It's very local, right? Might be 50 years from now, but it's local. That's very different from someone saying, what is the future of augmented reality and is there a whole novel in there? Yeah, of course there's a whole novel in there. There's tons of novels in there. Welcome to your local bookstore. They're there. But the difference between those two practices is that one is very, very specific and almost feels like in the city context, it's the difference between a little metabolist rabbit hutch studio apartment and a massive home, right? When you have a tiny little space, you have to pack everything in there that you need to live. Everything that the story needs to live has to be in that tiny little space. So it's sort of the story has to act like a little Swiss Army knife or like a little kit bag where your everyday carry of everything that you might need has to fit inside there. Whereas with a novel or some other long form piece that's more personally directed, sky's the limit. Please build your Hearst Castle, Xanadu, San Simeon, whatever, and then try to trim it back from there. Um, I'm not sure that answers your question though. I guess but for me though, that is how I see the difference between those. Are you asking what it is like now? Are you asking
Well,
like,
we'll come back
yeah,
to this, but this is a great way
yeah,
to think about it
yeah.
because it is exactly this sort of approach and the limitations of sort of corporate research anthropology versus using fiction as that sort of narrowing technique. So I want to come back to that. But first, I want to go back to Keiichi in this because I do want to ask. To me, the most interesting question of this overall is, how did you decide, Keiichi, to go from being a filmmaker to developer, particularly in such a difficult field as XR, this field where the reason there's so much science fiction, entire bookstores of novels about it, as Madeline put out, is because it's been coming for what, 40, 50 years? I mean, Neuromancer, crazily enough, I think I know it's more than 30. It's 35 this year, I think. So yeah, the incredible age of this field, longer is older than that. Sorry, much older than that. 45 this year, I believe. So how did you decide to make that leap? And then how are you using it? Like, do you actually have a sort of methodology, Keiichi, just to, I guess, narrow in on agents for a second? Like, so you put out the short film and then you start building the capabilities. How do you use fiction as a product roadmap? So how did you decide that I want to go from just being a critic of the field or a storyteller of the field to building it? And then how do you use fiction to build it? Two-part question.
Yeah, wow, that's a big one. I guess in terms of how I made this transition, I don't think I really did make a transition, and I didn't really consider myself to be a filmmaker then, and I don't really consider myself to be a developer now. The thing that's defined the whole way through is like I'm kind of a designer that ended up generally working in kind of some kind of directing position, whether that be directing a film or a game or an app or another different type of project, or kind of we're building these kind of tools to build agents as well yourself now, like you see in the beginning of the agents film. So I think there are many different ways to be able to communicate design. From architecture, we use kind of plans and sections, but I was kind of specializing and thinking about how to use film and motion graphics to be able to do that. And the sort of storytelling part of it, that kind of interest in fiction, really came out of I guess my personal interest in thinking about where things may be going, and as I learned the tools to be able to visualize and express those ideas, I started to become interested in doing it. And so at the beginning, it was more like I could express that through film just by myself than in my student bedroom, just like rotoscoping for hours. And then later on, now I have like more tools to be able to create real products that go out and work and can try and find a life within whatever turns out to be the future.
Okay, but then I guess
what was the second part?
well,
Sorry.
the second part is like talk about agents for a second there. I mean, did you create the short film Agents knowing that you were going to actually start building out those capabilities? And so this was a way to what test those ideas, test what it might
Yeah,
be,
I mean, I
gather
think that's a
support
great
for it.
example.
Why did you lead
Yeah,
with
I
the
think
film?
it wasn't like leading with anything, to be honest. I had the kind of idea way back in like 2017, and I've been like chatting with people about it since then. But the main sort of idea was really around thinking about the spirit world, or this idea of kind of technology as this kind of animist kind of spirit world that you can interact with technology in a different way. That's not just about jabbing buttons or whatever, right? Because that was my life at the time, is like trying to figure out how to do stuff with like jabbing stuff in the air, and it feels like there must be a better way. So then I just want to find any way to be able to express this idea, right? And I'm looking for funding for different projects. I'm looking for someone to pay for like a project which is a little bit like that, in the end, inevitably with all these kind of things, two things come along at once. One was an opportunity to make the film, and another one was the opportunity to make an agent, which was turned out to be Wall. And we did both simultaneously. The film was written before ChatGPT came out, but then took much longer to make. And then the agent itself came together very quickly. So you never know with these kind of things, but for me, it doesn't really matter, right? If it's the project or if it's the film, it's a way of being able to get those ideas out there, and then hopefully be able to use it as a stepping stone to the next thing, whatever that is.
All right, well, we'll come back to that. I did put a link in the chat to Wool, which you mentioned offhand. This is Wool is the AI owl that Keichii created, Liquid City created with Niantic and InWorld using InWorld's AI. I saw it demoed in Augmented World Expo 2023, and it was one of the most, for me personally, it was one of the most incredible demos I've ever seen, in the sense of like I understood what an enchanted world of talking objects would be like, and there they were. And whether that's dystopian or utopian, we'll see. But going back to Madeline over here, let's go back to the rabbit hutch here. And I particularly in talking to corporate clients, both of you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because Keichii mentioned his time at Microsoft, but both of you spend time inside large organizations as consultants or internal there, trying to advance better futures through the corporate bureaucracy and get products out there. And Madeline, I'm curious your take on like how is your fiction received by clients, or how do you use it as a tool to build belief? One of the great sayings we have in the threatcasting side, Buck Owens has a line, from bullet points to belief, or from bullets to belief. And that that fiction is that bridge to go from summaries of ideas into instilling true belief that can drive change. I'm curious if you feel the same, and to what extent fiction can do that, and how.
I mean, I would be hesitant to describe myself as advancing any particular agenda when I walk into a corporate or governmental or agency environment. Usually the ask is, hey, you've done this research, or you've been part of this research. Now tell us a story about what you found. Tell us a story about how real people use this technology, or how real people will respond to this scenario. How will people live in this perspective way? And the client may agree or disagree, or their team may agree or disagree. What the story does is create a landscape in which they can have that conversation. They can ask me about it. They can sort of have, they can sort of debate the merits of it, or whether or not they think it's valuable. One of my earliest jobs, one of my proudest moments, was when some stories of mine were presented for an audience that I never met. And a man at the back of the room stood up and said, "She's wrong, and I am leaving, and I will deliver a counter presentation tomorrow." And to me, that's one of my proudest achievements, because it actually started that conversation. Had the story not been written that way, that might never have happened. Ironically, one of the things that I always end up talking to people about, or that I end up bringing up a lot, is something that comes up around the agent's research, which is that enchanted world. I think one of the first stories that I wrote for the Institute for the Future, in the Coming Age of Network Matter anthology, all of us, and that was like 2013, I want to say, all of us ended up writing sort of haunted house stories, because the idea of that enchanted landscape, or the idea of the alive home that is alive, the landscape that is alive, the objects that are alive. That's goes back as far as fairy tales, right? When you watch Cocteau's Le Belle et la Bête, like, you know, there's a reason little hands come out of the walls to hold candelabras, because that is the model of what it is to have magical power. And so it is baked deep into uh the stories we tell, how we imagine power to be, what we want when we imagine an ideal. And you have to, I think, recognize that regardless of who you are writing for, you are still dealing with the legacy and sort of the valences of things like that. Uh, you know, the idea of being surrounded by a bunch of cute, cuddly agents who are somewhat alive, but also possibly not, who know you very well. Like, that's what happens to the Velveteen Rabbit. When you love something enough, you give it life, right? And so it's, on the one hand, does it seem outlandish? Maybe. On the other, look at the stories you've been telling yourself, or the ones you tell your children.
Yeah, that was a really important part of you know, trying to think about user interfaces and how to make new mental models that made it less friction to be able to
Right.
interact with the system, because, you know, computers and mobile phones are still very complicated. And I think, you know, the answer of like finding a new model is actually in finding an old model.
Yes,
And
absolutely. Yeah.
you know, I kind of compare it to ghosts and spirits.
Yes.
And but I think these kind of fairy tales are, you know, exactly the same kind of thing. The idea that the world is animate, that there are forces that control certain elements of life, is very, very compatible with all of the technologies that we have at our disposal now, including robotics, where you can have possessions of different forms by ghosts and things like that. So I think, yeah, it's very interesting to think about the fictions that form kind of narratives, like mental model structures, and also thinking about how, you know, how we can learn from how different cultures consider like what other people's mental models are. Helps to either like reinforce a particular direction or give us more opportunities for broadening the scope of it.
There was before I did foresight, I had a degree in Japanese animation, cyborg theory, and fan culture. And then, you know, everyone around me said, "What are you doing with that?" And so I got into something else. But there's a older manga called Gay 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 or something like that, that is, and in which the author, he describes the idea that, like, after 100 years something becomes alive, that if it is loved or taken care of or what have you, it gets this sort of, it is imbued with a persona. And what's interesting about, like, the intersection between those things is, like, it doesn't just have to be objects. You can start doing this for forests, right? And that's like the entirety of the Studio Ghibli output, right? Is like, all of these things might be alive. You might be interacting with something that just doesn't speak your language. And increasingly we're finding that out, right? You know, we're looking at things like actual whale words, or what bee dances might actually mean, and things like that. It might actually just be a great deal weirder than we think. It's not that it's, you know, bad or good. It's just weirder or less weird, known or less known.
All right. Well, I would interrupt on this. And so I put the link in the chat here. There's a link to Keiichi's 2020 essay Gods, where he lays out some of this, of using of Shinto animism as a way of discussing this, which I always thought was very apt. And I do like, I mean, to it's not a question, but I do think for people who watch Agents, it's really interesting that, like, the core conflict of that short film is this animist version of a panoply of agents versus a singular agent. It very subtly pushes back against this paradigm of, like, the one model to, you know, of a big tech stack to control them all. But I want to discuss with the two of you what I refer to as the torment nexus problem. I think most of the audience here is familiar with that meme in the sense of an author wrote, "Do not create the torment nexus," and then there's multiple business plans of the torment nexus. This is a problem that has plagued XR. I mean, Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash and Ready Player One by Klein are literally used as product roadmaps this day. Stevenson himself is also a practitioner, went to go work at Magic Leap, and is still involved in, I think, in a blockchain related startup here. But yeah, how do we avoid the torment nexus problem in using fiction? Because and I guess I'm going to start with you, Keiichi, on this one because obviously you've got a decade of reactions to hyper reality, including Meta. When Fast Company had exclusive access to Meta's Orion prototype glasses last fall, like the lead of the piece is like we can't stop thinking about the hyper reality film, and John Henke at Niantic has said things like this too. So, is dystopian fiction actually useful at this point to forestall potential futures, or do we simply have to provide better roadmaps because I don't know, the gravitational force field of late capitalism will pull everything into being a business plan at some point? I'd be curious your thoughts on this, though, as practitioners, how do we avoid the torment nexus problem?
Yeah,
Keiichi.
I mean, I am, I didn't create augmented reality, and I'm not in control of if it succeeds or fails ultimately. The influence that I can have, I suppose, is around trying to consider how it impacts people on a day-to-day basis and what the kind of implications might be. And I think some of my work, like hyperreality, serves as kind of a warning, but and some of them are more like provocations, or even more in the sense of like, here's a product proposal for something I think we should actually make. Everything kind of, yeah, but they all have a degree of curiosity to them, even if it's about like a warning. It's not just like, hey, this technology sucks, let's go do something else, because of course we could do that anyway. But it's more about trying to understand what are the implications, right? And some of them might be good, some of them might be bad. And I'm not trying to put myself in a position where I'm casting too much judgment on those things. I'm just trying to follow things in a sort of logical way. So, films like hyperreality are not really supposed to be kind of like a damning indictment of the industry or anything like that. It's just the kind of possibility of how things could turn out. And I don't think anybody wants to build that, right? Like whether you're in a big corporation or you're a developer working on a particular AR platform, so one approach is to try and change it, which I kind of tried that a little bit. I went to work for a company that I thought was relatively, unproblematic. I mean, it's a very relative term, but Microsoft. And I tried doing it for a bit, and then I realized that actually it wasn't about trying to change things. It was about trying to create new things and to show new ways of doing things. And with such an emerging field like these technologies, it doesn't work, I don't think, to tell people not to do things. It only works to show people all the amazing stuff you can do that hopefully takes into consideration some of those things that we're so worried about.
Well, as a quick follow-up to that one, can you talk a little bit about the details about your partnership with Niantic? Because there was the remarkable at the Reality Channels conference in 22 or 23, 22,
Mm-hmm.
John Henke invited you up on stage and literally said out loud in the sense of like, Keiichi made this film that showed what we don't want to build. And so we've partnered with Keiichi to build something better. How did that partnership come about? I mean, did they simply watch Hyperreality and reach out to you and say, we want to build this? Like, how did that work as like a lightning rod to basically pull you into partnership with them, which you're still building products with?
Yeah, I mean, like all of those partnerships or relationships, they often kind of come out of like weird or unexpected situations. So I just happened to be in a conference where it was kind of a small roundtable situation. John was like giving some talk, and I'm a kind of Pokemon Go fan, so I thought it'd be cool to go. And he takes out like some of my work as examples of stuff, and like I was like, oh, okay, but someone else realized that it was me, and like later like told him that you guys should chat, kind of thing. So I had a chance to talk to him, and yeah, I think he, like they're kind of a game company, or I mean, things have changed recently a bit, I guess, but they're kind of at this time they're kind of a game studio, but also developing lots of tools for thinking about interaction in XR. So with the experience I had from Leap Motion and my interest in thinking about agents and things like that, it felt like a very good relationship, and it's proven to be that way. I think they're a good size where you can still kind of be very creatively and strategically involved with making decisions, whereas very large companies sometimes suffer from being kind of compartmentalized or siloed, so that no one's really in control of the big picture, and the people who are working on, design or sound or batteries are not involved with thinking about the business model or the rights of bystanders. So it's difficult to make an impact in those kind of things. So yeah, my takeaway for that is don't try to change things, create new things. Yeah.
Great. All right. I want to interrupt for a second here. We're at the bottom of the hour. So again, folks in the audience, and this is like, it's amazing to see all of you here. I would shout out all the people I know here, but it would take too long. But yeah, please chime in with questions and we'll start working them in because yeah, it's high past time we do. And but I do want to go back to Madeline on this too. So one of the things about threat casting as a methodology, and I don't claim to be an expert like some of the other folks here, but in the rounds I've done with it, where if you're familiar with it in the audience here, you basically are given sort of parameters, as sort of Mad Libs. You're given sort of functions to work stories within, and then you have to come up with imagine a threat, and then you imagine a person responding to that threat somehow. And you have to do multiple rounds of it because the first round is always terrible. You fall back on tropes, you offer half-hearted ideas. You also have to get the mix of people right to pull those ideas together. Matt, I'm curious. You co-wrote How to Future. I'm curious, like, how do we do a better job of telling stories in group settings, in corporate settings, to advance this kind of fiction? I'm curious, like, how you see it, not just as when you are writing in your own head, but like in trying to instill this as a capability. Like, this is what we're all about here: is like foresight as a capability inside any organization. How do you sort of see that fiction component working, where you can encourage them to tell better stories of better outcomes?
Right. So for me, so I've been doing this since 2010, 2011. And I think the thing that if I were to go back and tell myself something, what I would tell myself is be less cagey about what it is you're trying to do with the story. Just outline it up front. Tell people ahead of time. Tell people what the goal is. Tell people what tell people more about the journey you're going to take them on. They have limited time. They're eminently distracted. They're not going to be able to put it together on their own all the time. They're going through their own sort of second screen problems. Tell them where you're taking them. Roadmap it early, even if it is like a work of fiction. I think early on, one of the things that I really struggled with was I didn't want to be perceived as talking down to people or simplifying it or like trying to make it easy or palatable or whatever. Because I considered that sort of insulting to the reader. It can be that. On the other hand, now I think of how simple the story is or how the story is presented as in itself a design affordance. The complexity of the plot, the gestures of the character, the how we organize the paragraphs, all those things are now to me part of the design affordance of the story. And can people sort of reach in there and grab what they need to grab? The KISS rule does do a lot, right? And so now I try to think of how simple I can make something rather than, how artful or how, I don't know, showy or something like that. I can make it. I now think about how simple it can be and whether or not someone who isn't familiar with the genre or who might not read for pleasure. I mean, with these reports, you never know. You never know if these are people who read. One of the best pieces of advice I ever got was like, I got asked to do a job. They'd already written like this big, beautiful document. And I, now I can't say big or beautiful anymore. Damn it. But they had written this huge document. And I asked them at the end, like, this is gorgeous, not to talk myself out of a job, but why do you need me? I think I've been muted. But
Nope, go ahead, Madeline.
But the why do you need me? And they said, well, we need something they'll read on the plane. And it was that. It's that. It's like the unit of paper fiction or the unit of the text told story is thin, it's lightweight, you can read it privately if it's printed, and it can go almost anywhere. It's quite portable, and quite useful in that way, and I think that's one of the reasons it's stuck around.
That's great. I think of like the opposite set of strengths and affordances from filmmaking in that regard, instead of the visual shock and awe.
Although ironically, like when I was a little kid, I wanted to be a filmmaker. That's like when I was like 5 years old. Like I have a firm memory of my kindergarten teacher asking, "What do you want to be?" And like we were drawing pictures of what we wanted to be. Speaking of like, creating future visions, and I was like, "I want to be a film director," and she's like, "I don't know what those look like."
I wanted to be a writer.
So, well, we should just hang out then.
I'm sensing a collaboration. I'm sensing a collaboration. Well, speaking of that, Paul, I'll get to your question in the chat in a moment there. But I want to ask Keiichi. So the opposite, instead of like talking about how to penetrate corporations. So you founded a startup, and in founding a startup, you have constraints and parameters and funding issues, and you have to assemble a team. And it's you and Annamil, an illustrator. You're a filmmaker. You're both designers. How do you think about it as Liquid City as a company? As a narrative-driven company, how have you assembled your team? Like, what are the talents you brought in-house, and what do you see outsourceable from that perspective of like, if storytelling is your core competency, then what do you have to have, and what is expendable in that regards as growing a company?
Yeah, I mean, we like I obviously have my personal agenda about I'm very interested about advancing interaction design. I'm interested in all these mental models and fiction as a methodology and those kind of things. But generally, our clients don't know or care about any of that stuff, right? So we have to try and figure out how are we going to figure out how we can be creatively satisfied by adjusting the brief or bringing in this kind of these kind of like processes as part of our own design process. But I think that all design work is this is actually something my tutor Nick Clear in architecture school used to say, that all design is kind of science fiction, and that we're always designing things for people in the future, right? Like especially in the case of a building, that building is not there yet, and the conditions when it actually finally gets arrives may be different. So you have to kind of project out from how today's behaviors may kind of change in the future. But I think for product and thinking about kind of the startup world, or like the world of small businesses or big companies, then that kind of vision, that sort of roadmap is a very, very important part of how they create an identity, how they differentiate from their competitors, and all these kinds of things. So we have found that like we're not kind of doing futures work. We're making games or experiences or like an interviewer app that you can tell your story to, and all of this research around interaction methodology and this kind of thing, that's all kind of embedded within those projects. So it's kind of uh something that it's an approach that we take, but it's not anything that anyone necessarily asked us to do, right? It's just something that we bring to the table, and it results in products that are different. And we trade on people thinking that those things are interesting and wanting us to build more of them. But some of those bets, we don't know if they're going to pay off yet. Like this big bet that we put on developing tools for developing character AI. This is yet to be seen if there's going to be a demand for it, but it's looking pretty good so far.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
let's do a quick audit. Paul, I think your question might be better answered offline by the threat casting folks. So I'll flag that for later. But Megan has a question here for you, Keiichi, on how you convey initial ideas to the client. And there was an earlier version of this too, in the sense of, and I'm curious, like the ROI of doing visualizations, films versus actually building these products there. Yeah, what's your approach there in terms of initial presentation?
Yeah, well, I mean, you saw just a few of Anna's paintings at the beginning, but we have like a literal, world illustration award winner concept artist. So often a painting that Anna does at the beginning of the project becomes the kind of guiding light through the whole thing, and right up until the end, we use it and kind of compare what have we built, and comparing it to that. I think like painting is similar to fiction in a way that allows you to express some kind of subjective qualities, or sort of suggest impressions that are harder to quantify in a particular metric. But once it's easy to tell if it's there or not. So I think, yeah, the kind of early stage stuff we're often using paintings, but often we don't really have that much time either. So we're just talking to people directly and showing them our past projects and this kind of thing. So yeah.
Great. All right, we'll come back to yours in a second, Tommy. But Mal, I want to ask one of the questions I had is I'm curious your thoughts on genres and sort of on the if you could talk quickly about sort of your thoughts on the sort of state of the art of science fiction prototyping and science fiction, because it's interesting is like if cyberpunk started as a warning and turned into a product roadmap, there have been success stories like we've seen the rise of solar punk. I was reading a great essay earlier that like solar punk is basically now reality. A lot of solar punk concepts have become actual world projects. Afrofuturism sort of remains out there as underdeveloped. I'm curious your thoughts on yeah, the potentials of these genres to grow and to incept greater belief in the overall project, I guess. But yeah, is that an overall successful strategy and tools? 'Cause I feel like a lot of foresight practitioners have had a real like crisis of faith in the last last half decade to decade or so. But at the same time, there's a lot of room for optimism too.
Yeah, I think, and I think it gets into the difference between the foresight practitioner solely, like the person who is only a foresight practitioner, or who does their art via foresight only. Like that's the difference between presenting an array of possible visions and allowing someone else to make a decision, and the and versus presenting an array of possible scenarios or possible visions and saying, but we like that one. Because what an artist does, whether they're a filmmaker or a painter or a writer, is that they present a vision. The idea of when we shoot in an aspect ratio, we are creating a sense of space. When we light someone, we are recreating their features. That vision comes from me. It comes from him. It comes from you. It comes from whoever is holding the camera, whoever's holding the pen, whoever's holding the makeup brush. Those are things that come through an individual, and they are individual visions that are attached to someone's beliefs, training, culture, what have you. When those things are depersonalized through a field or through a report or what have you, the contents of that report get very easy to sort of separate off, hive off, vivisect, take, strip for parts, turn into something like that. I think there was this attitude, I think, for a long time of like, I'm not going to tell you how I feel about my work, or I'm not going to tell you what this means to me or what have you. And now I think people actually do need that. Like they do kind of like need to be told a little bit about, do you believe that this is the thing to do? Do you think this is the right idea? What is your opinion on this? Whether or not that's like a graph at the end of a report or what have you, I don't know. I think everybody's going to have to handle it differently. I think that like when you are an artist, though, when you create sort of through the individual, or when you are presenting something as yours or your perspective, the opportunity that you then get is to create something that is aspirational. And when you talk about a genre, for a lot of people, science fiction is an aspirational genre, or was an aspirational genre. There was that like sort of, where is my jetpack? Why is, where are my food pills? Why do things not look this way? Blah, 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 retrofuturism, whatever. The flip side, though, is that science fiction might not be the most optimistic or aspirational genre. In many ways, it isn't. So you then have to start thinking about, what is the most aspirational genre? Where are like, what are genres people actually want to live in? And it's usually not this. Like nobody is signing up for the Blade Runner theme park. They might be because it probably has great noodles, but but very few. Like it isn't drawing Harry Potter numbers. Put it that way. It isn't drawing Magic Kingdom numbers. Why is that? Why would that be? And is it, what is that? Why is that? And I think, like the people who like, let's do wish casting now. The people who need to be doing the people who could be changing this game are people like Hallmark and Harlequin and those folks. You want to talk about an aspirational genre? It is romance. Human redemption is possible. People love each other, and the best man always wins. That's aspirational on the human level. He just might happen to be a robot. I should know because I wrote like a trilogy of novels exactly like that.
Well, we have an AI question which I'll come back to you on in a moment here because we'll think about this one because we got there. But I do want to go. I want to jump in with the audience questions here. I want to direct Tommy's question to you, Keichii. Pulling on the thread of make it short, digestible, on a plane. What similar regrets are associated with widespread XR adoption? Are there human bandwidth limitations, mental, temporal, sensory, etc., that have to be navigated carefully? I guess I interpret that as like, is there a chasm of belief? Like, how do you make it believable within the context of current experience while still showing that future to them? I could be misinterpreting that one, but please take that any way you like, Keiichi, if it makes sense to you.
Yeah, I love what Madeline was saying about making it very easy to understand for people, and I think coming from architecture school, where a lot of the time um, uh, people in authority use kind of obfuscation to sort of hide, they kind of hide their actual design behind lots of layers of presentation and sort of rhetoric, and I maybe like some of my films look like they're kind of highly produced, but my main aim was to try and make them as direct as possible, right? It's like literal like point of view, just like kind of crappy phone camera footage, make it very relatable and real, not trying to use any kind of conventions of Hollywood or make it look in any way slick. So I guess I kind of, I sort of enjoy. I can't find the question that you were referring to. Could you just remind me of that part of it?
If you scroll up there slightly, it's Tommy Sebastian, MITLL, 12:41 p.m. or 5:41 BST.
Yeah. So yeah, I think the like the consumability of the things that I make is always of like top of my mind, and I think video is still like the number one way to be able to get ideas out there quickly. But I also think that the social media landscape has changed a lot since I started making these films. And back in the day, people made a lot of like these kind of interesting speculative short films and stuff on YouTube or Vimeo, and people would actually look at them and share them, and they'd have a reasonable shelf life. Whereas now I feel like the social media video based kind of news cycle is so fast that you can't really pour you know months and months of work into a single video, and then in the case of hyperreality will be years of work into a single video and then hope it does well. So yeah, I think my expectation around like what kind of content is going to cut through has changed a bit, and experimenting with lots of different things. But obviously when we're doing prototyping work on headsets and things like that, and they're not even out yet, we're not doing it to try and like shift a lot of units. It's more about trying to experiment with how people want to engage with that kind of content, and they're thinking about sort of the length of experience and the complexity of interaction is always top of mind for us. So yeah, I think it's the kind of technology. XR is the kind of technology where it becomes low friction after you've gone through a ton of friction, to get it charged and put it on. And I don't know if you're going to need to have some rings or something, you like kit it up. And then once you're in there, it's like, oh yeah, content everywhere. So easy. But, to get people over that threshold, like I wear contact lenses instead of glasses. So, there's a lot of things that AR struggles against. I'm not particularly like a kind of cheerleader for the industry per se. So I'm very curious about what kinds of use cases and applications emerge. And I think it's already proved to be very interesting and useful in many ways. And we've built many experiences that I think are valuable in and of themselves, without needing to point to a future where everyone walks around in AR glasses all the time. But this has never been my focus. It's always about trying to figure out how emerging technologies as a whole contribute to the way that we live our lives. And some of them are definitely have more hurdles to get over, but it's just part of the design brief as always. Yeah.
Great. All right, we have 10 minutes left. We'll try to work through these questions. I want to direct Nick's question to you, Madeline. So this is the AI question. How has the role of storyteller foresight practitioner changed when your clients themselves have access to an increasing variety of generative story machines? This is interesting because, Madeline, I know you refuse to gaze into that particular abyss and keep your mind protected. But, one answer to this is like the futurists themselves, the foresight practitioners themselves are adopting these tools. Cindy here has like a wealth of GPTs of her own. The folks at Changes that you wrote the book with have Foom, their sort of like AI tool to discuss AI. I'm curious, Madeline, how do you prevent the clients in this case from pursuing bad, easy, disposable ideas that they can whip up from a chatbot, et cetera? There, or how is AI improving or corrupting foresight practicing in fiction?
I mean, I can't stop them from doing that, really. There's nothing I can really do to stop that. That would be, I don't know, criminal. But I can't like hold them for ransom or what have you. But the I think it corrupts in the same way that it always corrupts. Like, one, it uses a ton of carbon and just corrupts the energy supply and corrupts water, pollutes water, takes water away from, things that actually need it. It does create sort of sort of kipple effect, to use Philip K. Dick's term. That there's sort of there's cruft. There's sort of just like it's just slop. So that makes it much harder to. It's as though you're creating silt instead of it's as though you're creating pyrite instead of gold. There's a chance you might find gold in there, but not if you're flooding everything with pyrite. You might find something and it might be very useful and it might be like super, super convenient, which is good. I haven't seen the use case necessarily where somebody finds something that is so genuinely altering for them that they couldn't also have gotten it from a member of their team. What makes me genuinely nervous is that it is a technology that can be very easily leveraged to separate people from accountability and liability. As long as the machine did it, it can't be the company's fault. And once that exists, then suddenly you don't have, like, the idea of blame, responsibility, accountability, that all goes out the window. So that to me is a thing that is corrupting at the level of the rule of law, right? Then there's then there's the aspect of the brain works like in a use it or lose it model, right? Much like all of the rest of our body. Using the imagination and developing it and cultivating it is as useful to us evolutionarily as learning how to run, learning how to walk, learning how to learning how to make a speech. Any of those things are very useful to us. If we lose that capacity, there is no guarantee that we will get it back. We might. Our bodies are very plastic, especially when we're young. But if we aren't teaching those skills, they might die out. In the same way that there are, entire sort of crafts of like muslin making and so on that went away. We might lose that. And if we lose that, the point at which we will miss it the most is the point at which there are things like massive communications outages that make the other mechanism impossible to use. So right when you would most want to be able to tell stories around the campfire, you might not be able to, or you might not feel equipped to, or you might not even know how to communicate with other people in that same way. And I think like that's sort of what I worry about, less about me and more about sort of societally or culturally or at the level of our evolution as a species.
Great, thank you for that. No, it's I don't have a link to it handy, but I believe there's that MIT preprint on like actually using EKG on people, and you can actually see brains changing whether or not they're using these tools. There's some interesting stuff there, and there's some great questions about it, which I don't think we'll get to in a moment. But I want to get back to Patrick's question. I guess I'll direct this to Keichii. I think you covered this to an extent there, but I'm curious about how you choose or how you select elements in, say, hyperreality and agents in terms of like what existing paradigms you want to critique or why you think they're interesting. Hyperreality, I think my favorite part of the film. Well, the urbanist in me loves like the cityscape and the strobing of the wayfinding, but I do love the hilarious gamification scenes in the supermarket with like the talking dog there, and like I mean, literally companies are building that now. Once again, that became an inadvertent roadmap where they conversion this. But yeah, how do you choose what you want to critique and draw in these ideas in there? Because I do think again, Agents has this great thing where the sneering guy who's got his floating orb that represents all of his data in one pond is very unsympathetic versus our creator, where she's got all of her darling little agents there. So yeah, how do you choose what you want to deconstruct versus what you want to advance? Because it is sort of a push pull in your films.
Yeah, I think when I go through making a new film or something, I have or building any kind of new project that has this kind of narrative element to it, kind of start to try and think about the themes and the characters that would represent those themes well, or I have a whole kind of rationalized process. But in retrospect, all of the films I've made have always been kind of autobiography about just the kind of stuff that just annoys me or I find to be like, I don't know, stupid in the world. Or so I think, I guess a lot of that type of work has to come from you somewhat as an artist and just try to imagine that, like what you think in your own subjective world is a valid thing, and it's okay for you to express that throughout our work. And I don't pretend to kind of back that up with particular yeah, I mean, I guess I do have a philosophy, but I never really unpack it in the kind of public setting. It's usually wanting to use the work as a way of helping people to unlock ideas or get a different understanding on the space. So like I kind of like to leave some of those things open to interpretation as well. I talked about this kind of direct approach of wanting to make the things accessible, but also you want to leave something not so that you're. I think these kind of cultural artifacts are only interesting insofar as that they can create some kind of conversation or conflict in the viewer's mind. So I wouldn't want to make a film that kind of rammed a particular ideology around down somebody's throat, right? Like I want to try and make something that feels more open-ended or nuanced. So yeah, I think it's that kind of communication question is like twofold.
Great. All right.
So I keep on like going off from like many different
No, I love
directions
it.
from the question.
We're
So I'm
we're just about out
yeah.
of time, so I guess a fun way to end this is sort of beyond fiction itself is I'll call on Madeline for her thoughts in a second. But you mentioned there, so you created for Augmented World Expo this year an RPG, which I thought was interesting. I mean, many people. I mean, Pokemon Go for that brief moment in 2016 was the sort of like breakthrough moment for XR, and then of course Pokemon Go is still hugely popular, but it didn't expand from there. And then many people have tried various paradigms of various things in addition to the hardware. Do you suspect is games the next piece of this of live storytelling together? What are your thoughts as a practitioner on this is about, the paradigm, the one weird trick that will finally make XR truly break through with that? I'm curious what sort of directions you're pointing in about
Hmm.
what is the mechanic, what is the thing about it that will make it special for people that will make it break through?
Yeah, I mean, I think in this case we were very interested about, I think our first kind of stage agents, it was kind of amazing to have an embodied character that can react and speak to you. And then we added the ability then for it to be able to see and understand your world and the objects within it and be able to talk about those things with you. We've done other projects which involve connecting to environments so that it can have a spatial understanding through VPS or analytics technologies. Where it is in the world and what kind of things are around it. And we can also start to use the AI brains that we're building to drive animation and other scene things in the world around us. So it feels like a broader shift towards this idea of computing that draws from context as well as explicit interaction. So I think it's kind of an evolving process that we just keep on adding these new kind of capabilities. And the use cases are across any different thing you can imagine for that you would want to use an app for, because really we're trying to design kind of an interface layer that could connect you to a navigation agent or a dating agent or whatever else it is. So I think, for us, it's really about trying to kind of not necessarily trying to find like the one thing that's going to make AR successful. Actually, it's more just for us to be able to kind of extend our own research and take these incremental steps towards defining new interaction paradigms that allow us to use computers in different ways. And yeah, I think the cultural, like more like film or like narrative work is very interesting as part of that process, is being able to bring kind of a more holistic understanding of how these technologies might impact people in the world around them. Because you have, protagonists, you have people that kind of forces you to take into consideration certain things. So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Keiichi. Madeline, the last question, last word for you is since you mentioned that you've written about this extensively too, we're discussing AI. We're also discussing like, yes, that to extend sort of companionship in the report, I tried to coin the phrase AIR for artificially intelligent reality as separate from traditional AR in the sense of it could be a full-scale rendering of an AI agent like Wool that is chatting with you. It could be an AI that's on your wearables, but it seems like this paradigm of spatially intelligent AI companions or agents or guides or these kinds of things. I mean, Keiichi again has built some. Spirit of the Fairy Building is one of the examples in the report elsewhere. Mal, what do you think is the trajectory of that one as someone who has thought about this for a long time? Because we're seeing increasing reports about AI psychosis, obviously the rise of AI companions. Is that going to be the use case that basically we're going to basically use AR to create our imaginary friends? Is that going to be it, or how do you
I
expect that
mean,
will
yeah.
unfold?
I mean, like, I think that the idea of having Jiminy Cricket around you all the time is like very normal. Like we've told stories about that forever. That is, that used to be the angel and the devil on your shoulder, right? That used to be maybe your patron saint. That used to be a ghost in the house. Like that's very normal. Um, there is a thing around the psychosis though, which is that I guess speaking as a woman, I can say that like half the planet gets trained in what it means to create life, and the other half might get trained in it, but not always. And so the idea suddenly that you might be responsible for a thing that is alive, that is constantly learning, that is constantly adapting, that could be killed at any time if the wrong power surge happens, or God knows what, could be taken ransom by ransomware. Who knows? That is not a fear that like everybody gets brought up with. That sense of responsibility is not ingrained in everybody from the period that they first start receiving toys. But it might be about to change, because otherwise you're going to get more of this like, oh my God, I've created life now. That's what that is. It is the existential horror of realizing that you've created something for which you are now responsible, or which you might be responsible, which is special and unique and beautiful and alive, and how terrifying that can be, and how scary, how humbling that can be. But not everybody gets the training, and the fact that life might just involve that as a matter of course.
Well, that's a great place to end it, to think about that question of empathy and being able to ground oneself in the thinking of that. So thank you. Thank you, Madeline. Thank you, Keichii. Thank you all for joining. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And of course, want to thank you both again for your literal input in the case of Madeline, and inspiration in the case of Keichii in this report, and crafting it too. We'll be back soon, I'm sure, with more of these webinars, but what a great way to kick it off. So thank you both so much. And yeah, we'll be sure to follow your work, promote it, and go from there. So yeah, thank you both. And thanks
Thanks
you
so
all.
much, Greg and Cindy. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you,
Bye, everyone.
everyone.